Yeah, no, because like when you talk about it, kind of my thought of like the problem of GMOs isn't like, oh, it's going to affect people or anything. It's about kind of the sustainability for the land because, the nitrogen and that if you have a higher yield, logically that the higher yield has to come from somewhere. But now, as you explained, you could have crops that are modified that even put more of the nutrients and all that back. So in my head, it's like, is there any downside?
Right. And that's the thing is, I haven't seen a downside yet. And that's why I preach them so hard. Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brandon Black, and in today's episode, we're talking all about kind of a different topic today. The transition between countries from primary to tertiary sectors is one of them, but we're also going to talk about some hunting and just a few different ways that agriculture kind of intermingles with different types of societies. So here to help us with this topic today, I have my guest, Allison, or I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that properly.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and let you give your own introduction, kind of let everyone know who you are.
All right. So today I'm Allison. Kind of not really more involved with agriculture. My background's more in finance and physics. I'm studying physics at university. I also run a business in the financial sector. We're building out kind of education platform, brokerage, all that. If you look me up by my name, you can easily find any of that. I also have a podcast on the side about finance, and I do a bunch of stuff, but not much related to agriculture. But I'm very interested in learning more.
Awesome. Well, like most people that I brought on this podcast, we met on Reddit. So I'm curious, before hopping into the conversation, what was it that drew you to my podcast? Why did you all of a sudden have an interest in talking about agriculture?
Well, there's two parts to it. So the first topic that I mentioned, for me, that's very much kind of economics related, and so I find it quite interesting. I've actually had a discussion not that long ago before I kind of go back to you about the topic about the actual effects as like how countries transition. It's something that I found like, well, how does this actually work today? Because there's a lot of kind of explanations in theory about how it went through for a lot of kind of Western countries and how the economy developed and industrialization and all that. But I was quite interested in how does it actually work for countries today, which are trying to transition between the primary to secondary and then tertiary sectors within the economy. Now, when it comes to the hunting side, that comes more kind of out of a personal interest because I'm from Czech Republic, where we have a lot of gun culture. I know you're from the U.S., so you guys are kind of the stereotype picture child of gun culture. But I've got to say, Czech Republic, much better gun rights, much better access because we have the right to bear arms and we actually can get things that you guys aren't, which is kind of funny
Nice.
for a European country. So I was just kind of interested in that since, I down the line in Czech Republic, it's kind of a year-long process to get a hunting permit. So it's kind of lengthy and you have to do a lot of training and stuff like that. And I'm going to have to study a lot of material anyway. So I was just wondering, how does it relate to it? Because the whole role of hunting in Czech Republic is solely for preservation and agriculture purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think those are both really interesting topics, and they're ones that we haven't really covered a whole lot on the podcast before. So I was really kind of drawn to those topics when you mentioned them because I thought that'd be kind of an interesting thing to dive into. So cool. I think that's kind of a good place to start. So, I mean, it seems like you're a bit more drawn to the first topic you brought up because, from the economic point of view, you seem to have a bit more of a foot in the door with that kind of information. So before we hop into things, for anyone who doesn't know, could you, just kind of briefly explain what is meant by, a country transitioning from a primary sector to a secondary or tertiary sector?
So essentially, primary, secondary, tertiary are kind of like groups of industries. So primary is more of kind of the farming side. So typically, when a company is heavily when the employment, so where people work, is heavily in the primary sector, that typically means majority of the people farm. So you have usually small farms owned by individuals or small groups, and that's where majority of the people are employed. Secondary is then typically kind of manufacturing and the industrial side. So, for example, if you look at kind of China, where they were about 15 years ago, with heavily kind of focused on manufacturing, that would be kind of the secondary sector. And then tertiary is kind of the services side. So, for example, like banking, flower shops, which are like things like that. And there's actually kind of a new one that's quaternary, which is the high-tech, cutting-edge innovation stuff. But there's some discussion whether to actually accept that, so I'm not going to get into all that.
It's interesting that that breakdown reminds me a lot of the actually the agricultural revolutions. And so for I'm not sure if you're familiar with these revolutions, but basically we have some controversy on whether or not we're in the fourth or the fifth, but kind of for similar reasons. But the agricultural revolutions were based around that similar idea. The first revolution is that we figured out how to farm. We have basic tools. We kind of we established a sustainable form of producing food at a consistent rate. And the second revolution was introduction of technology like tractors, like it was like the mechanization of agriculture, the introduction of a lot newer tools that like the plow and things that we typically wouldn't have had access to. And then the third revolution came around in like the mid 1900s or the 20th century. And it was the also known as the Green Revolution, and it was the introduction of like chemical fertilizers and pesticides and that sort of thing. And then we got into the revolution that we're in now, which is kind of being called the automized revolution. And I personally believe that we're in a fifth revolution that's kind of starting, but that's being debated right now because we're going back and forth between, are we in the automized revolution or are we in the regenerative revolution, where not only are we more automized in the sense that all of our technology that we originally had is now being ran by computers and a lot more advanced, with artificial intelligence and all that kind of stuff. But now we're using older, more traditional methods of agriculture combined with newer technologies. That way it's less harmful to the environment and getting the better yield that we were trying to get from the commercial side of things. So when you were explaining that, I was like, I see a parallel here. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'm sure it kind of links together because like a lot of kind of the justification for moving from primary to secondary to tertiary to potentially quaternary is based around kind of the production of food supply. Mm-hmm. So it was when we could, when a smaller group of people basically could supply the food supply for everyone else. It's when we were able to kind of move to industrialization and then all the other sectors. So it would appear to me that it is quite linked. Mm-hmm. So it kind of makes sense that it is similar in their way.
Yeah, and I would say that you were asking about how agriculture kind of evolves with societies as they go through those sector changes. I would say that that's probably as close to your answer as I can get in a single explanation. Is that agriculture evolves almost simultaneously with the societies. As they move into secondary and tertiary and potentially the fourth sector that you were mentioning that's kind of being debated right now. It seems that agriculture kind of it's evolving simultaneously, but almost separately. And what I mean by that is that I actually just did an episode on this about how the urban communities, the more industrially developed communities in a society will evolve technologically, and they'll kind of go off and they have what we consider to be a more civilized, styled society. They have a lot more buildings. They have a lot more, different types of jobs. There's a variety in what the needs of those people are. And agriculture almost doesn't necessarily get forgotten, but it's more along the lines of like agriculture is not their primary concern anymore. So people kind of just don't focus on it as much as other issues. And I think that can be best summed up with, there was a quote, and again, for the life of me, I can't remember who said it, but basically it was, when we don't have food, we have one problem. When we have food, we have many problems. And it's that idea that, if we need to focus on a way to grow food, that's the only thing we need to focus on. As soon as we kind of figure that out, then that's not really something that we need to worry about as much anymore, because that one's already kind of taken care of. And so I think I would say that's probably the case for most countries that transition from those primary sectors to the other sectors, is that they've kind of just figured out how to get food to food production to a point where they're satisfied with it. And so while the food production industry may evolve, technologically speaking, it isn't a primary focus in terms of careers anymore. So you'll start to see lower percentages of the population involved in food production, and higher percentages involved in more scientific or technological careers that end up going back into benefiting food production as kind of a byproduct.
Yeah, no, like looking at it, because for me, like you can see this kind of as a clear path when it was kind of the cutting edge innovation. So as let's say as you brought automation more to farming, and a lot of this that was usually kind of with the cutting edge of the technology. But what I'm kind of really unsure about, or that I'm like looking at with the transitions of countries which are still primarily in the primary and secondary sectors as far as the employment there, is for them it's not really kind of a limitation of what's currently cutting edge. They're very much transitioning by kind of acquiring this technology from other areas, from other countries where it's already been developed.
Mhm.
And I was kind of wondering, are there any kind of changes in this approach? Is it just accelerated because the technology is already there, or is it, for example, large government funding really pushing this up? Because, for example, we can see in Brazil, there's a lot of kind of a push to grow farming quite a bit, to group it together under bigger businesses, and there is quite a bit of kind of governmental support that helps it move much faster towards kind of automation, a lot of that, and scale it up quite quickly. Or whether for the majority of the countries, it is still kind of the natural progression we've seen historically.
So to that, I would say that I think it's a bit of both. This is all going to be dependent on, it's going to be like a country by country basis. Not every country is going to go through this transformation in the same ways. I think that there is a natural cycle through which these things are going to happen. These countries are naturally going to reach that point at some point, in the future. It may be accelerated through government support, but I've also found that there are some countries that don't have government support in terms of agricultural, production, and so they often either kind of struggle agriculturally, or they have to reach out to other countries for that support. So an example of that would be through use of biotechnology and GMOs. There's a lot of countries that straight up ban GMOs, or they ban any form of growing that kind of food. And because of that, they are almost entirely dependent on imports. And they're even, they're starting to see larger rates of food deserts starting to appear in their countries. Actually, I talked to a Swedish farmer a few years ago about this. He was talking about how Sweden hasn't completely outlawed GMOs, but they're basically like socially banned. People won't buy them, so nobody grows them. And because of that, their food supply has shrunken so much that they're almost entirely dependent on imports just to be able to have a steady food supply. And so, and like the same kind, the same but different kind of things are happening in developing countries that are trying to become more agriculturally independent, but either their governments don't really support agriculture as much, and so they tend to kind of struggle for that sort of thing, or they have an issue with their land, whether it's infertile or like the soil is just not quite to snuff to be able to grow the kinds of crops they need to grow, or they don't get enough rain, or they just don't have the infrastructure in place, whatever it is. A lot of the issues that have to do with a lot of developing countries, getting out of that, that struggle with farming has to do with they don't have access to that kind of stuff because of, lack of government support or lack of foreign support or whatever it is. To give an example for that, I know that in a few developing countries, we actually exported golden rice, a genetically modified crop that was, engineered to try to benefit children that were suffering from anemia and from other, vitamin A deficiencies and other sort of issues from that. But I think that having government support and having foreign aid and having all these things definitely accelerates the process. But I think that to some degree, it is going to happen naturally for most countries, as long as they're not kind of stuck in an economic hole where they're just kind of they're never going to get out of that sector. As long as they are progressing even at the slowest rate possible, eventually they will reach that same level of evolution as the other countries. It just might take a little bit longer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that actually kind of gave me an idea that I got thinking about, because we have, if you look at a lot of countries, like a lot of Western countries, there's a lot of subsidization of the farming industry to kind of, I suppose that would be to keep it viable and affordable to a lot of people. So like, has there been kind of a transformation due to like that has just become so much more expensive that this is required, or why has the farming industry in a lot of the Western countries become so dependent on subsidization?
So there's a few reasons for that. Some of it is that, due to environmental changes, there's a lot of land that wasn't quite as arable as it used to be. And so because of that, it costs a bit more to be able to produce on that land at the rate that it used to be produced. I think one of the largest reasons for subsidization, and this might also vary from country to country, but regulations tend to be a big cause of it. I've noticed that in areas where there are higher regulations, there are also higher subsidies. It's almost as if the government's saying like, hey, sorry that we're making you play by our rules, so we'll pay you a bit more to do it. And so I think that might be part of it as well. But I think that you're right. And, in the sense that it seems that in countries where they're more agriculturally viable, there seems to be higher rates of subsidization. I think it's because the government start to realize, like, hey, there are some countries out there that are as technologically advanced as we are, and they are not doing as well agriculturally. We better make sure we protect our farms before they start to go down that route. And so I think there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of give and take there, as well as, they don't want to risk running out of a source of food, but they also don't want to give the agricultural communities too much. Like going back to the regulation thing, they don't want to give them too much freedom in terms of what they can grow and what they can't, because that might throw off the economy, or it might throw off the markets, or it might throw off the environment. Like, there's so many factors that are reliant on what the agricultural communities are doing, that it's almost in the benefit of the government to kind of make sure that everyone's playing fair and that everyone's doing what is best for the country, not just what's best for them. So if that kind of makes sense, I'm not sure if that was.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, but it kind of got me thinking about kind of like the balance between the long term and the short term, because if you have countries with a lot of subsidization, that would, in my head, that would encourage a lot more farmers to produce, aim for higher yields and really focus on the short term. But from middle school education about agriculture, so I'm sure there's more complexities to this, but if you farm land a lot with like a lot of crops all the time, that a lot of the nutrients and all that's required for a lot of the crops would kind of decrease in the amount of it that's in the soil. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't, like, how is this balanced? Because for countries which have good quality soil that can be quite used for farming, it would seem to me like they should encourage a bit less farming, so it is more long-term sustainable as far as kind of the food supply, as opposed to really pushing for high subsidization, because high subsidization means higher kind of better prices for the farmers, and as such, naturally I would feel like it would encourage more produce to be made.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an excellent point. And that's actually, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that is an important piece of that conversation. Is, like you mentioned, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for us to keep farming and to pay farmers to keep farming if it's going to destroy the soil or the environment, or, the surrounding areas, because that's one of the primary complaints against agriculture, is that it's environmentally damaging. The solution to that is that, at least in the United States, I know some other governments are kind of working on this too, but they are actually subsidizing farmers to use more environmentally friendly methods. So I know that in my local area, regenerative agriculture has been starting to become adopted more often, which involves a lot of like no-till. It involves cover crops that not only do they not disturb the soil, but they actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil. They can even absorb carbon from the atmosphere and kind of reduce the carbon emission rate and put that back into the soil as well, to try to regenerate some of those microbiomes that were destroyed by crops that kind of leached them. So that's something that's been being in the works. I know for dairy operations that a lot of dairies are being paid by the government to produce or to construct methane digesters, which are these massive machines that basically take methane that the cows are producing and convert it into a renewable energy source. And so, like, there's a ton of newer innovations, and this is kind of what I was talking about. This is what I believe is the fifth revolution of agriculture. Mm-hmm. It's the combination of newer technologies with more traditional sustainable methods that are better for the environment and get the higher yield at the same time. And so the governments are really trying to look into that kind of stuff, and they're really pushing, the environmental scientists and the agricultural scientists. They're really pushing to kind of get information out on this stuff, so that way they know what to subsidize and what not to. But right now the focus is, let's subsidize all of the things that are good for the environment and are still going to feed enough people. And so you are seeing, yes, there are some farms that are being subsidized to leach the ground, essentially, which is something that we're trying to get around. But it's a similar situation as the gas versus electric car kind of situation. It's like, we don't have the proper technology to completely replace the gas industry yet. So we have to kind of tough it out for now, but eventually we would like to replace it with a more sustainable source. And that's the same thing for agriculture, is that right now we're doing what we can to feed the population and to get our yields as high as possible. We understand that it's not the best thing for the soil. It's not the worst either, though, because we are definitely, especially through the use of genetic modification and with other technologies, we are definitely leaving less of a footprint than we ever have. And we're trying to implement new technologies that are going to reverse our footprint and actually give back to the environment. And so that's kind of the balancing act that you're looking for, is, we're subsidizing things that are actually doing well and getting the yields that we're looking for.
And what about kind of the scaling of that? Because this kind of just reminded me of the fact that, like, basically the sizing of the population as kind of the optimization problem. So you have enough in taxes to take care of the population that cannot make income. So it's like the issue China is facing, where they don't have a sufficiently sized labor force, and it's going to continue shrinking, which is going to significantly harm their economy. But so you naturally need like a slight increase in the size of the population to have a sustainable economy long term for others, for other things. So is like whenever things like this are being planned, how how are the considerations of the it sounds horrible to say population management, but I guess population management like taken into account for kind of the projections of what will be needed in the future, as far like long-term future, as far as the scale of crops and agriculture that'll be needed.
Yeah, no, the population is definitely one of the major concerns of agriculture right now, especially because anyone who's involved in agriculture kind of knows the statistic of, by the year 2050, we're supposed to have a population of almost 10 billion people. And, we're going to have to feed people that about 70% more, food than we ever have produced in the history of agriculture. And like that, all these numbers are around there just to kind of remind us that like, hey, we have a lot of work to do. So the population is definitely something that agriculture is concerned about. I'm not sure we found a surefire solution just yet, because the most simplistic solution is, hey, we have a lot of people who are unemployed. We have a lot of jobs in agriculture that need to be filled, but that's not the most sustainable solution, because not all those people are suitable for agricultural jobs, or not all people want to work in agricultural sectors. We have found, at least in the United States, we have found a lot of success in using the workforce from foreign aid, bringing in immigrants from especially from Mexico, and from some from Canada as well, to help on some of these farms. And actually, I was just talking to my roommates about this last night. If we could benefit those workers a bit more by aiding with their path to citizenship, instead of just punishing them for even trying, then I think that would help out with the workforce situation quite a bit. But it becomes a balancing act of how much of the population can we get involved in agriculture and keep them involved in agriculture. And kind of what I mean by that is, one of the big issues that we're seeing in agriculture is like the average age of, at least in, most of my statistics are going to come from the United States, just because that's what I'm most familiar with. I have some stuff from other countries, but that's kind of, and the United States is a half decent model for agriculture around the world, because a lot of other countries start to kind of base their systems off of United States agriculture. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other more developed countries are starting to see these same statistics start to come true. But in the United States, the average age of the American farmer is about 58 years old, and he's getting older. It used to be 57 a couple years ago, and then 56. Yeah, they're getting old. Less than 2% of our population is actively involved in producing food. Like, we have next to no actual farmers left. And I'm not saying we need more farmers, but we definitely need more people involved and interested in the industry. And so a lot of the solution there kind of goes back into education. It's, introducing agriculture back into schools and kind of reminding people like, hey, there's a ton of jobs out there that require, that would be really nice to have you as part of, and it doesn't involve working on a farm. Agricultural research is a thing. Agricultural law is a thing. Agricultural, people involved in, people who want to get involved in computer science, there's an ag job for that. I actually know people who went to school for computer science, had no experience in agriculture whatsoever. They became computer engineers for John Deere. They designed GPSs that were used in tractors. I know people who were who were technologists, that they were studying to be engineers, and they designed drones to be used on farms now. Like, there's a ton of application for non-agricultural jobs in the agricultural sector that are not only applicable to agriculture, but they also don't require people to get down and dirty like they don't want to do. And so my proposed solution for the population issue is, if we can incorporate them back into agriculture, if we can kind of remind them how much agriculture has to offer them, then maybe, and I'm not saying everyone needs to get involved in agriculture, but maybe we can see more of a push towards people to get involved in jobs that benefit agriculture. And that would kind of, I'm not sure necessarily that would fix our issue of the population disparity between the agricultural communities and the non, but that might at least mitigate some of the issues that are being caused by having an overwhelming population that's not involved in agriculture and a minuscule population that is.
Yeah, no, like, I have to say, like, whenever I look at agriculture, it's so fucking high tech nowadays. Like, it's so cool. There's so much stuff.
Yes.
Like, and whenever, I don't know, I just really kind of I can appreciate just how much technology there is. Because actually back home, so I'm originally from Czech Republic, and about 3 minutes away from where my house is a big research institute for agriculture where they do a lot of testing for some things for the local agriculture university. And it's really kind of like, I'm like, this is cool. Why aren't people more aware of this? Because you talk to people in like tech or something, and they're like, oh yeah, I want to go research AI and machine learning, and I'm like, you could do that. You could do that in agriculture. There's so many like really cool opportunities that I kind of see there, and I'm like, well, if finance, maybe one day I could kind of look that there. Cause there's just so much cool stuff there. So
Yeah.
I don't know, like it definitely feels like just like there should be kind of more encouragement possibly, or just more awareness. The way I look at it, of kind of what's out there. Because if I didn't live so close to the research institute, I don't think I ever would have known just how high tech. Actually, maybe not, because I just remembered there's the game. What is it called? Like the farming simulator or whatever.
Oh,
yeah. That like showed off a little, like a lot of kind of cool technology, like GPS farming and all that. I think has there been any study as far as the impact it has had as to bringing more people to agriculture? Because I feel like that would encourage a lot of people because of the technology that it shows off.
So I would have to do some research to get the actual numbers, but I have seen articles before that have talked about how a lot of people who play Farming Simulator, they may not be actively involved in the industry, but they seem to at least have more of an appreciation and kind of awareness of agriculture from that point, which I think is awesome. As someone who's doing a podcast around teaching people about agriculture, I think that's kind of a good thing. And not just Farming Simulator. There are other games that help out with that too. Stardew Valley is one of them. Harvest Moon.
Stardew Valley is so good.
Yes, I love that game. I want to do an episode on that one soon. But yeah, no, there's so many games and movies and TV shows that are subtly introducing agriculture to people, but like they don't feel like it's being shoved down their throats. They're just kind of enjoying it, and then they start to realize, is this actually how it works in real life? And they look it up and they start to realize that even Farming Simulator is a bit behind in terms of the technology. Like you don't have access to drones and and precision agriculture and artificial intelligence and all that kind of stuff on the Farming Simulator farms. You just have like a GPS tractor or two. And so I think that even as those games develop, there's going to be more and more people involved in agriculture, because they're not even going to realize just how much there is in agriculture. Like you said, there's so many opportunities that people tend to not even be aware of. Like I always encourage people, like I have a friend who wants to be an accountant, and I'm like, hey, that's great. You should go be an accountant for a farm. And he's like, what are you talking about? And he looks into it. Farm accountants make a lot of money, because it's really, really hard to manage, the finances of a farm. And so like there's so many different jobs in agriculture that are jobs that you wouldn't typically think of, but it's really cool when people kind of find out like, hey, what I want to do applies to agriculture. Why don't I just do it for that? Because they're like, oh, I support agriculture, but I want to do this instead. It's like, why not do both? You don't have to be involved in producing the food, but you can still help support the industry by doing this as an ag person.
Yeah, like this kind of sounds to me like, because we talked about kind of the 3 stages and possibly the 4th one, which are kind of mapped in like kind of moves as a lot of the workforce has moved around to kind of tertiary, like secondary, tertiary, quaternary. And it kind of sounds like to me there needs to be a 5th move that goes like a bit rebalancing back to the primary sector, because there is just so much linked to it.
Yes,
It feels like that'd be definitely some kind of an interesting study to kind of look at. I might actually bring it up to some of my friends who are doing economics as a thing they could look into, because I feel like that could be a very interesting move that based on the way you talk about it, is probably going to happen within the next 20, 30 years.
Oh, definitely. I'm actually studying something right now that I'm doing a mini series on my podcast about, kind of like a theory that I have about the cyclical nature of the urban-rural split. So kind of what caused the urban communities to separate from the rural communities, and why people aren't as aware of agriculture and aren't as exposed to what's actually available in it, and why most people don't even realize that agriculture is evolving at the rate that it is, and then kind of how they're starting to get back into it. Over the past 30, 40 years, we've seen this massive division of people, and actually it's been even longer than that. People moving away from the countryside of things. They're moving more into the cities, which is fine. But then they start to have misconceptions about agriculture and kind of what's going into their food. And that causes fear, and it causes a bunch of other things that are causing issues for agriculture. And then now we're starting to see people get back involved in it. And like you said, they're seeing things like, on movies, on video games, on TV that are interesting to them, and then kind of bringing them back to, and especially during the whole quarantine, during lockdown and everything, the amount of gardeners and the amount of people who got involved in agriculture just out of pure curiosity from that was huge. I had so many people coming to me asking me questions about stuff that they had never even, been on a farm before. And they were asking me questions that I didn't expect them to be able to even have a solid awareness of, because they hadn't been exposed to it. And so I think that, to kind of cover your point about the fifth, potential move of the, the, I don't know what you would call it, a quintary. I don't know what the fifth movement would be called, but yeah, that idea, I think would be really interesting to cover.
I think I was definitely kind of, as you were talking, I was started thinking about kind of the effects of kind of COVID-14, because a lot of people have kind of moved out more, some to the suburbs, but even further more into the countryside. I know a lot of people from, the financial sector and like consulting, a lot of these kind of stereotypical high paying jobs, who are now buying up like a small farm out in the countryside because they can just work remotely, and they're now getting a lot more interested in, all right, let's, I bought a farm, so let's actually use a bit of that land or see how that goes. So I think there's definitely going to be a change there that COVID has had a positive impact on, I would say, and especially kind of around the fear that people don't understand what's going on. It is going to bring that closer. But speaking of fear, there's a kind of a bullet point I made here that I wanted to kind of come back to. It's kind of like talking about GMOs a little bit, because like GMOs, like naturally, it's just genetically modified, which there's nothing wrong with. It's just the more nutrients it takes. But when I kind of look at it, is because you talked about the kind of supply that's required, and the balancing act, I suppose, there is like, is the outlawing and kind of restrictions on GMOs in many countries, are they really on all GMOs, as it's kind of would seem to a layperson like me, or they actually kind of very much focus on GMOs which are very bad for the land and allow for some of the more kind of actually, are there any GMOs which are more kind of sustainable farming focused than just high yield focused?
So that's an excellent question, and it's a lot more complex than the usual "are GMOs bad or good" kind of conversation, because it specifies, are there different types of GMOs, and are some good and are some bad, and the countries that outlaw them, do they only outlaw the bad ones, or do they outlaw all of them? In my experience, through the research that I've done, it seems that the countries that have banned GMOs ban all of them. It's just a flat ban on anything that's genetically modified. And this is the problem I have with it, is they don't define GMO very well. Like we all kind of, we can, if you say a GMO, everyone kind of knows what you're talking about. It's something that was done in a lab. It's something that, typically they transferred a gene from one species into another species, and that caused an alteration in their genetic code. Like that's kind of what was agreed upon to be a GMO. But if we're speaking generally, the words matter here. And maybe this is just semantics, but genetically modified organism. If you have a dog today, it is a genetically modified organism. If you have like any animal, any crop, any human today is a genetically modified organism. Our genes have been modified just through natural selection, through selective breeding, through evolution. We are not the same genetically that we were 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, whatever. A lot of things have changed genetically for most living things on Earth. So you can say technically that everything is a genetically modified organism. It's just, I think that almost like a more accurate term would be an artificially genetically modified organism. I think that's kind of the better way to look at it. And that's why I have a problem with countries banning GMOs, is that technically if you ban GMOs, you ban everything, but that's beside the point. I get what their point is though. To my knowledge, so this is something I need to kind of preface this conversation with. There are not that many GMOs. There's this idea that 90% of crops are genetically modified. That's not true. I think there's about 20 crops, and let me look it up for you real quick. I think there's only about 20 crops in total that are genetically modified. Some of the big ones are like corn, soybeans, I believe maybe cotton. Some of those. Corn is the most genetically modified. About 98% of all corn is genetically modified, but that's kind of the only crop that we have that's like that genetically modified. Most of their crops, it's like, less than 50% of them are actually genetically modified. There's not that many. But when people talk about, are GMOs good or bad, or are there good and are there bad GMOs? Oh yeah. So here we go. Today, there are 10 GMO crops currently produced in the U.S., while more than 120 GM seeds with the unique traits have been deregulated. More than 90% of corn, soybean, cotton, canola, and sugar beet acreage in the U.S. is GMO. So that's U.S. But I know that we tend to be a lot more accepting of GMOs than most other countries. So I would argue that most countries probably have even less than we do, and we only have 10. So that's kind of puts in perspective just how little this is actually being used and how large the fear is over a threat that's really not that bad. To answer your question about the utility of GMOs, like are they good or are they bad, or are there good and bad kind of situation, there have been again, I'm only one guy. I've done research for years. I started doing research when I was about 16. I've been doing research ever since. And I'm 21 now. So I've got about 5 to 6 years worth of research that I've updated every year. And to this day, I haven't found a single credible source that has linked GMOs to any kind of negative effects, even environmentally speaking. There hasn't really been any connection between genetically modified organisms and, environmental damage or health effects or, anything like that. And, that begs the question of why we're not doing it more. Well, for one, it's really hard to do. And for two, it's expensive. And for three, a lot of people don't like them. So we don't do them for that reason. But typically GMOs are genetically modified for like one of like 3 different reasons. Usually it's yield, it's resistance, and it's durability. So what I mean by that is so for yield's kind of self-explanatory. So, if you genetically modify corn, it's going to produce more corn. If you genetically modify cotton, it's going to produce more cotton. Yield is, and that's actually been proven that, there was a study done by North Carolina University that was about a tobacco crop that was genetically modified had about 20% increase in yield versus a non-genetically modified tobacco crop. 20% is not a lot, but it's also tobacco. Every crop's going to be different. It's going to have different yields, all that kind of stuff. So yield is a big one because we want to be able to produce more food. Another one is resistance. A lot of crops are genetically modified to become resistant to pests, to weather, to, all kinds of different, outside, potential dangers to those crops. We genetically modify corn to have an internal pesticide. So basically whenever a bug eats it, it dies. And that pesticide doesn't affect humans at all. I mean, there's never been a single report of a person getting sick from genetically modified corn that has been linked to the ingredients inside the corn being changed. And actually it's a positive thing from an environmental point of view, because that means we don't have to spray pesticides on it, which lowers the amount of residue available in the soil, and that increases the health of that soil. So genetically modified crops are actually more beneficial for the environment instead of less so. Like I mentioned earlier, we use some crops that are able to take nitrogen and carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil. We are able to genetically modify crops that couldn't do that before, and now they can. So now we have even more crops that can do that kind of stuff. We've been able to genetically modify strawberries, so that way they're more resistant to cold because they typically would die in a cold storm. So it's like a lot of the reasons we genetically modify things is for the safety of the crop. It's that way we can keep them around longer. They can benefit the environment for a longer rate for us. That way they can produce more food for us, all that kind of stuff. Like I said, to this day, it hasn't been brought to my attention in any way that genetically modified crops have had any negative health effects or negative impact on the environment. And so I think a lot of the reason that they're banned by a lot of countries is due to fear mongering, but there could be some other external reasons that I just haven't come across yet. So I'm not going to say it's impossible.
Yeah, no, because like when you talk about it, kind of my thought of like the problem of GMOs isn't like, oh, it's going to affect people or anything. It's about kind of the sustainability for the land, because the nitrogen and that if you have a higher yield, logically that the higher yield has to come from somewhere. But now, as you explained, you could have crops that are modified that even put more of the nutrients and all that back. So in my head, it's like, is there any downside?
Right. And that's the thing is, I haven't seen a downside yet. And that's why I preach them so hard. There aren't many things that I say there is no disadvantage to this. We should be doing this all the time, because most things have a downside, obviously. But GMOs is one of the few things that nobody has really been able to find yet. I mean, the only downside that we could possibly pin is that they've been around for 26 years and that there's still the potential that something might come out of it that we haven't seen yet. But 26 years is a pretty long time. I mean, I know it's not as long as some other, technological advancements that we've made, but it's a pretty decent, chunk of time that you think we would have figured it out by now if there was something to be worrying about.
Well, if I'm going to be fair and I kind of approach it for the scientific side, when studying kind of the effects on people as far as kind of the long term things, 26 years is really nowhere near enough. I think it took like if you look at how long it took with, for example, tobacco to properly be aware of the negative effects,
That's
that was
fair.
far more than 26 years. So what like in my opinion, I'm completely fine with GMOs, and now but just was concerned about the impact. Now that you explained that the impact's not really notable on the land, then I'm just all right. Yeah, let's just use GMOs everywhere. But I would say saying, well, we've had them for 26 years. I would say that's not a sufficient. If we reach a point where we notice some, minor negative effects that we haven't seen yet, it's let's. I understand it's bad to do with because it is people's lives, but what we can let's like you could look at it this way: if you increase the yield 20%, and you mentioned we need to increase the yields by 70% to sustain the global population, well, like what is better? So potentially some minor effects that we're not aware of, or a ton of people starving, and there it just seems to me, well, let's just go with GMOs. Like, what's the problem?
Right. And that's been my argument from day one is that, we really, let's just say that there, even if there is potential side effects that we haven't seen yet, it's entirely possible. Like I said, or like you mentioned with the tobacco issue, 26 years isn't very long in scientific terms, but it's because we haven't seen any major red flags like within these 26 years, and because we need such an increase in our yields, I don't think it's a bad I don't think it's a bad idea to kind of look towards the options that we have. I've had people ask before, like, well, I mean, right now we have a sufficient food supply. We actually have way too much food. We're wasting food. Why do we need to increase our yields right now? And my response to that is always, well, if we don't increase them now and we get to 2050 where we need to increase them and we don't know if GMOs are going to work, we're going to be kind of up a creek without a paddle. It's better that we experiment with it now, see that it works, make sure that it's sustainable, and
Yeah.
ensure that we're not going to go into this blindly without any kind of backup. Like, yeah, we may be increasing yields for no reason. And, there are potential, ramifications to that we might see later down the road. But we haven't seen any right now. Everything's been environmentally sustainable. Everything's been great with it. And we want to make sure that we have it ready for when we need it.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. Honestly, I don't know. I don't think I have anything to say on GMOs because I'm just like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do it. It's like the thing is, has there been any moves as far as GMOs to kind of more deregulate them in a lot of countries? Because I'm like 20, and it seems to me most of my life that I've been aware of GMOs, they've always been very frowned upon and restricted. So has there been any kind of more of a recent move that has increased the popularity of GMOs?
So yes and no. There's been a little bit of both. There's been bigger pushes against GMOs, and there has been bigger pushes for GMOs. So it's kind of not necessarily that the public perception of GMOs has gotten better, but there's been more awareness, at least, of what they are and kind of what they're doing. So there's two organizations that I kind of always cite for these. There's the non-GMO, I think it's called the non-GMO project or something like that, and it's focused on trying to like dispel GMOs, kind of like basically tell people why they should not be trusting GMOs. I've gone through their website a million times. I've like researched every paper they've written. They haven't really come up with anything that's that like definitive. Yes, this is an issue. It's a lot of speculation and what ifs, and that's fine for people who are worried, but if we're looking at a potential solution that we need to be able to count on, we kind of want some concrete yes or no's. And so that's where the GMO Literacy Project comes in. And the GMO Literacy Project is an organization that's focused on the opposite. It's actually trying to raise awareness for the benefit of GMOs. And since their efforts have become more popular on social media, there has been a bit more of an acceptance of GMOs, especially in a lot of Western civilizations. But I still haven't seen a lot of push in countries that have already kind of outlawed them to reverse that idea.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are some GMO activist groups isn't quite the wording I'm looking for, but kind of like it's like supporters that are trying to make it more more understood to those governments, but they're kind of, they haven't had a whole lot of luck. I know a lot of farmers in those areas. So that Swedish farmer I was talking to is one of them that have tried communicating with their governments, have basically tried to, voice their concerns with the governments and with the local communities about GMOs being outlawed because it's going to lower their ability to even produce food at a successful rate. And they haven't had much luck. So the efforts are getting better, but they haven't made a ton of ground yet.
Right. And so, looking at it, if there's clear kind of scientific pattern of, well, there's no clear issues, a lot of that's kind of fear mongering, then, I understand whenever there's fear, there's a lot of money to be made on it. But what is kind of is there some overarching motivation for a lot of these kind of anti-GMO organizations, or is it purely just driving fear because fear can drive revenue?
I think that, I don't ever want to say that something is completely motivated by money or by greed or just by people trying to take advantage of scared people, but I haven't seen a whole lot of any other motivation. I know that non-GMO food obviously costs more than GMO food, and so that can be a driving factor for it. Anything that has the non-GMO label on it, the non-GMO project gets profits off of that food. And so that's kind of already, that should be a red flag right there. It's not like the GMO Literacy Project gets money off of genetically modified food. So it's like, why are we paying an organization that's telling us that what we're buying is
Maybe
bad?
they should. Maybe
right.
they should get
right.
the GMO tags, the new trend in the food grades. Oh, sorry,
right.
Food grades.
Yeah, that might change some people's opinions on how the dynamic works. But yeah, no, like we're paying an organization who's telling us what we're eating is bad, and it doesn't really make much sense to me from that perspective. I do know that some of the fears that they have been kind of preaching about are mostly health related. They haven't really had any kind of supportive claims on GMOs in the environment. That's one that they just kind of accept as just how it is. They've tried to make claims about like, oh yeah, GMOs have pesticides in them, which is bad, but it's like, well, actually, they're lowering the rate of pesticides we have to apply, which is good. Like they have pesticides in them for a reason, and they're not harmful to humans. They've already been proven to not be harmful to humans, unless, again, we haven't seen the long-term effects yet. But their main concerns have to do with certain, so like Roundup. I'm sure you've heard of like the Roundup controversies.
No, not really.
Okay, so Roundup is an herbicide that is basically, it's mostly used to like kill weeds. It's a we use it in agriculture. Well, not anymore, but we used to use it in agriculture to kill off a lot of weeds. And it was produced by a company called Monsanto, and Monsanto was under a lot of heat for using Roundup because it contained a chemical called glyphosate, which was incredibly there was a high risk of it to cause like birthing defects and stuff like that. And so there was a lot of controversy over it. A lot of people got really upset over it. Well, we have genetically modified corn that has Roundup in it. It has glyphosate as part of the corn, and it's called Roundup Ready corn. And so, and like the same goes, we have like Roundup Ready cotton, we have Roundup Ready, like a bunch of crops have been genetically modified with this. So a lot of people are like, hey, we can't eat that. It's going to cause birthing defects. There hasn't been a link yet to corn that has Roundup in it having the same effects as Roundup itself. It's almost, I'm not sure if it's just because it's in a lot more of a trace amount, or if it's just because of the, the chemical composition of the corn itself is kind of diluting the, the danger of the Roundup or whatever it is. But there have been fears about, GMOs causing autism or causing, other genetic deformities or causing, cancer. To this day, and I always make the claim of like, I'm not an expert.
The thing is, you have fear like that of, sorry,
everything.
But yeah, you have fear of that in like vaccines and all
Right.
that. So
Yeah.
And also, just before you continue, I want to kind of say one thing. It's for everything, it's like there's an amount of it that will kill you, and there's an amount that will do absolutely no harm. You can drink too much water, you can eat too much lettuce or something.
Right.
Everything can kill you in sufficient amounts.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's always that's always my counter argument is that, like people say, oh, GMOs will cause cancer. Walking outside will cause cancer. The sun causes cancer. You can't make a claim of, like obviously there are some chemicals that are worse for you than others. Like smoking is a lot more likely to cause you cancer than eating a salad probably is. But that's not to say that, anything's impossible. Like, that, like you can make the claims that GMOs cause cancer, but there hasn't really been any scientific evidence that supports that claim. And if there's really no scientific evidence supporting it, then I'm not really going to back it. And I actually had somebody before kind of challenge that and said, well, how do you know that they're not just botching the evidence, that like, they're not releasing it that way nobody finds out? I was like, because they're not terrible people. Like I'm pretty sure they would, if they knew there were bad things happening with this food. And also it's 10 crops, like it's not like it's a massive majority of our food.
Yeah, but like coming back to that, the example I used before, tobacco industry. So many studies that were so like, I get the people, like majority of the people in any industry are never evil and never that, but there's always there's always someone who might just focus more on the revenue, and
that's
the same
fair.
way, as long as there are examples of it happening with tobacco. I don't know. I get that on one hand, it's one of like the few examples. So always coming back to it is kind of deficient to the progress it can bring. But I would also say it's important to be aware of the fact, well, it is actually possible that a lot of these studies could just be pushed by pushed by a lot of the businesses that are actually driving them to be more kind of positive towards what it's arguing. But that brings me on to something I kind of wanted to touch on with this, which is like, I get in the US, a lot of this is heavily privatized. A lot of this research is completely privatized and all that, which, I prefer that, but let's not get into that part. But in a lot of European countries, you have a lot, like these studies are oftentimes commissioned and overviewed and all that by a lot of governments when they're trying to decide what is actually the right solution. Now there, you still have some bias, you still have some motivation, but at least there I would expect the research to find something. If there is a problem and a lot of those countries are looking to ban them, well then of course they should like try to find problems. And if they even if here they haven't found problems, like clear problems, if that can be proven, then I really don't see how you could have such a some kind of a clear bias of everyone's trying to hide these horrible effects from you. Because even with tobacco, you had countries where they were like, oh yeah, there's problems here, there's stuff here, and it was just kind of pushed back, so it wasn't very public, but it still existed out there.
Right. And so, and that's a solid point. And the reason I often kind of refute the tobacco argument, which is it's a fair point, but the reason the reason the tobacco industry hit it for so long is because, like you said, they're making money off of it. You can make more money off of non-genetically modified foods than genetically modified foods. We already talked about the labeling issue, how, these companies are getting paid more to tell you that genetically modified foods are going to kill you than the people who are actually producing the genetically modified foods. I would say that, if you could sell GMO foods for more, then sure, I would, be totally on the idea of, yeah, it's possible they're hiding some stuff. But, I've looked through all the reports of why countries have been banning GMOs, and most of them have to do with the fact that the public just doesn't trust them and won't buy them. Like, it's not even like full on like, oh yeah, our research team found some issues, so we're just gonna not sell them in our markets for a while. It was more like our people don't trust them, so we're not even gonna deal with them. And right. So and like I said, there's always a possibility that there's something there that we just don't know about yet, but I just haven't really seen enough evidence to really support that claim. So I'm not really on board with it just yet.
But the thing is, like, you kind of mentioned that GMOs and non-GMOs are kind of more expensive. But what about the kind of comparative cost as far as the net profit on them? Because when I think about it, of course, like non-GMO crops, also they have lower yield, so they've got to cost more to produce. So is the actual profit margin when you take away the money that goes to the organization higher than for GMO crops? And also, is because when you talk about it, the motivation to push one narrative or another comes if the businesses, so if it's competing businesses, so if you have separate businesses that have GMO crops and the separate businesses which mainly focus on non-GMO crops, because I don't know, potentially is it that one company or like a conglomerate, several companies have both the GMO and non-GMO crops, and in that case it would start to make sense to have some collusion there for a push.
Right. No, and that's a solid point. When it comes to growing non-GMO crops, the profitability is, I would say, marginal. There's really not a ton of difference, just because the input costs are almost identical. The difference is non-GMO crops might take a bit more input costs in regarding to pesticide use, because again, they don't have that resistance. But again, I would go back to the idea that only 10 crops, at least in the United States and even less for other countries, are genetically modified, and therefore all other crops are going to be grown exactly that same way. And so because of that, there's less room for, for that idea of it's more profitable to produce GM crops. It is in a sense, but it's also more expensive because GM seeds actually cost more than the non-GM seeds. If you're talking about organic, that's a whole nother thing. Organic farming is a lot more expensive to get into, but there's a lot bigger paycheck at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like a, high risk, high reward kind of situation. But it's a difficult, it's a difficult claim to make that people are, because there are people who grow both, they grow both GMO and non-GMO, but it's not always because they want to cause like schisms in the market, and more so because it's more profitable to grow GM soybeans and non-GM corn, because maybe that's what they have access to in their area, or maybe because like I said, maybe they're trying to grow crops that there is no genetically modified variant, and so people say like, oh, you're growing both GMOs and non-GMOs, you're probably trying to spread some false narrative. And it's like, well, maybe grapes aren't genetically modified, so I'm growing grapes and corn, so I only have the option of non-GMO grapes and GMO corn. Like, that's just what's available to me. So it's a lot more circumstantial than just like a clean cut, yes, so they're doing this, so this is going to cause suspicion. There's just, because of the lack of abundance of GMOs in our production, and because of the the very minuscule difference between the profit margin between GM and non-GM crops, it's just not quite, I don't think there's enough there yet to really make a solid claim on it just yet.
Right. But so one thing that kind of doesn't make sense to me is, because you mentioned that the input costs for GMO and non-GMO are the same. Mm-hmm. And if they are the same, per unit of crop, then what's the point of GMOs unless it's literally just space efficiency? Because if you have the same input cost, then no matter how big the population like globally is, you just put more of the money towards it. So is the reason for GMOs being used, since the input costs and then output costs basically are similar, just a higher cost for non-GMOs, why would anyone use GMOs, since if the costs per unit to produce it are basically the same as you mentioned, then there's no reason to use GMOs.
So I would say that at that point, there needs to be conversation had about the steps in between the farmer and the retailer. So on the farmer level, the input costs may be similar. It costs the same to plant the seeds. It costs the same to fertilize them, to do the irrigation systems. They all have the same requirements. There are some crops that are genetically modified to be more drought tolerant, and so they may require less of an input in terms of irrigation. There are some crops that if and some crops that are not even genetically modified, they're just naturally more drought tolerant, and so they're going to have difference in input costs just because of that. But let's just say I were to grow two cornfields right next to each other, one's GM and one's non-GM. If it's going to cost pretty much exactly the same all the way up until the pesticide point. Once at the spray, then the costs are going to be slightly different, because I'm obviously not going to have to spray my GM field nearly as much as my non-GM field. So that's going to be a difference in input costs. Everything else is going to be fairly similar, but you're also going to have the higher input costs of the GM seeds being, costing more than non-GM seeds. So then you start to see the input costs be fairly similar between spraying and the seeds, but it depends on how much you're spraying and how many seeds you get, and, if all of your seeds germinate properly and all that kind of stuff. Where you start to see the difference is like we already talked about, the higher yields for the GM crops are going to earn that farmer a bit more of a pay grade. But when we start to look at the processing plant, the processors are going to throw out any foods that are not to snuff in terms of their quality requirements. So like they're doing food safety evaluations, and they find non-GM crops that are covered in bugs, and they're going to throw that out. They're going to throw out less of the GM crops because they're not going to have bugs on them. They're not going to be as unclean, for lack of a better word. They're going to be a lot more uniform. They're going to have a lot higher yields. They're going to look a lot more market ready, for lack of a better term. So, when the processor is going through it, it's going to be less wasted food. And so that's going to change the price a bit as well, because they're going to have more GM crops because they survived the sorting a bit more easily. And then you go through the whole labeling process, and to label something non-GMO, there's a cost with that as well. That's actually what raises the price in the store. So when you talk about everything that goes in between the farmer and the retailer, you start to see that there's going to be some difference in cost, but along the way for both products. Typically, GM crops tend to come out cheaper just because they tend to have less issues and there tends to be less wasted food along the way. Meanwhile, the non-GM crops or even the organic crops, they're getting thrown out. They're having labels put on them. They're having all this marketing done towards them, which costs more money and ultimately costs, it costs the consumer more, even though the input costs of both of those crops may have been very similar.
All right. So basically, if I understand correctly, the per let's call it market ready unit of the crop with GMOs, that's still cheaper.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So yeah, if you're going to the store and you're going to buy GM corn versus non-GM corn, the GM corn is going to be a lot cheaper, just because, like you said, it is it's cheaper to produce in a sense, but it's the input cost may not be as the input cost may be relatively similar, but you're maintaining more of the crop and higher quality crop at the end of the day, which is going to be easier on the retailer than the non-GM stuff that gets thrown out throughout the processing plant.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of explain what confused me here. Because typically within economics, if you kind of talk about the input cost, you look at like the per output unit. So so it's basically, if I just to kind of check again, I understand correctly, the input cost per field is very similar, but then the cost per the actual output unit is lower.
Right.
That's how it works, right?
Yeah, I would say that's an accurate way of looking at it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So, and disclaimer for for anyone listening and for you as well, I'm no expert on this. This is all based off of research that I've done, but there's always things that I'm going to miss because I'm not an economist. I'm not actively involved in every step of the process. I have seen the process and I have kind of watched from step one to the final the end point of the product, kind of what happens, but there's always things that I'm going to miss. And I'm also, I'm a college student, so I'm not going to know everything. But so yeah, so if anyone ever finds things in their own research or through their own experiences that are different than what I'm saying, I'm more than happy to, to be challenged, and I may be wrong. There are some things that I could be inaccurate about, but these are all based off of things that I've done, research on over the past 6 years and that I've experienced through my encounters with the processing plants and all that kind of stuff, and talking to farmers who actually do go through this kind of stuff.
Right. And so that kind of brings me back to something we talked about with like Sweden having to import a lot of their produce and things like this. I'm assuming, that's got to come from some countries. And is that, is that purely based on kind of the arable land that's accessible in those countries, or is how they kind of accounted for? Because normally when you kind of think about a country's agriculture, it's kind of aiming it to supply locally and then a bit for export. And if Sweden has to import a lot of it, do they have do they look at other countries and discuss with them, hey, we're going to need a large supply from you, and then those other countries intentionally kind of boost up their production? Because if that's the case, and then you think about the fact that they also often subsidize a lot of the agriculture, that seems to me like a lot of the countries that Sweden is then importing from, they are paying for Sweden's food in a way.
Yes. So there's a lot of complications with food trades. That's a whole mess when it comes to economics, is just because of the way the different countries work, and there's free trade agreements that kind of come into place with that, and that can change the markets in ways. And so I'd have to do more research on specifically like the Sweden situation and kind of what their agreements look like and what their food supply looks like. But the way it was explained to me by the farmer was basically, he kind of just gave me the rundown of, because their food supply is so low due to the lack of arable land, a lot of their land has been urbanized, and the arable land, or the land that is arable, is just not, there's not enough of it to produce a sufficient supply for, kind of like a self-sufficient community. And so like the entirety of Sweden couldn't survive off of their land. And he said that one of the things that might have saved them was an increase in yield that would come from genetic modification, but their government basically said no. And so obviously they still do some level of agricultural production. It's just not nearly to the degree they need it to be. And they use whatever they do produce for trading purposes mostly. Or maybe like for small domestic use, but that's, is really not a whole lot. So he said that a lot of their a lot of their food is a lot more expensive because it's having to be imported. And so the import costs are changing, the markets a bit on what food is available to them. So it's like it's really expensive to eat in Sweden just because the fact that they don't have access to their own food anymore. And so I'd have to look at, the specifics, like I said, of what foods or what countries are supplying them with food and what those countries are demanding in terms of price, and for that export, for the exportation of the food. But I'm not quite sure what that transaction looks like or how that impacts the price of, the growing cost of that food versus the purchasing price of the food in the final country that it ends up in. But yeah, I'm not quite sure.
All right, yeah, fair enough. Because looking at it, kind of, because I'm in the UK, and the UK is also quite known for importing a lot of its food, and I don't know, it just seems like a lot of the subsidization kind of works inefficiently.
Hmm.
But yeah, anyway, I think we will have to kind of look into that a bit more. But I think this kind of brings us a little bit to our second topic. We talked about the GMOs, a lot of the pesticides and stuff. Well, there's also another pest, which I guess you could call a lot of the guess actually, what do you call the animals that kind of mess up a lot of crop? I feel like
Well,
there's a term for them, and I'm forgetting it.
pest is kind of the common term, but wildlife would be kind of probably the
Yeah.
best way
Oh
to
yeah.
define
Oh
them.
yeah. Pest and then pestis. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got it. I don't know. For some reason, when I was thinking pest just now, I was just thinking just the little bugs and not the actual
Yeah,
animals.
no, anything. I mean, even like weeds are considered pests. So anything that
Yeah.
can basically, a pest is defined as anything that is not part of the operation and can disrupt the operation.
Hmm.
So yeah.
So yeah, when it comes to that, the one thing that can happen is there is a lot of the animals very much kind of because there there's a lot of population management that goes on with planning in the hunting community. When you're kind of, let's say you have a new area in a country, well, let's say a big farm is a lot of land, and they're moving over to, let's say, a slightly different crop because it makes more sense for them. Are are there some discussions around the impact that's going to have on the, I guess, pest or wildlife population in that area? Because, for example, it might be more fitting for one animal as opposed to another.
Yeah, definitely. I think in most operations, the impact on the ecosystem is always a consideration because you always, whenever you develop a plot of land for agricultural use, you always have to kind of consider what your environment is and how that's going to impact your crops and vice versa. And not just crops, if you have livestock too, that can also have an impact
Mm.
because, some local pests for livestock operations may be coyotes or wolves or, anything that can damage your animals. So it's always a consideration when starting an operation, but I wouldn't say necessarily that that's always the inspiration for hunting. Hunting in the United States kind of tends to take one of two paths.
Mhm.
So like you mentioned, in your home country, that the purpose of hunting is mostly for preservation. That is one of the purposes for hunting here. We have regulated hunting laws that are entirely for the purpose of an environmental conservation. It's for the sake of making sure that we don't deplete the population of certain animals too much. There is a certain level of trophy hunting that's kind of involved too. I personally don't exactly support trophy hunting quite as much. I prefer, if you're going to hunt, then it needs to be used for something, either eat the meat or use it for preservation of the population or whatever the case may be. You hear a lot of people that oppose hunting, because of those reasons. They're like, oh, you're just going to mount it on your wall and you're just killing animals for no reason, without exactly realizing that hunting is a very necessary part of population control, and that without it, those animals will start to have a lot of complications in their ecosystem due to over competition of resources. And so like that's a whole thing in and of itself. But the way agriculture and hunting tend to relate to each other tends to be, like you mentioned, more on the pest side of things and also on uh, the impact of the ecosystem. So like
Mhm.
as agricultural land is being developed, the surrounding areas, they might have a deer or two that kind of wander in and they're fine. People tend to not bug them. But if you have you know a coyote that's eating your chickens, or a fox that's coming in and attacking your chickens or your lambs, you might want to get out there and kind of pick off some of those animals in the surrounding areas. And most people that I know of don't do it just for the sake of doing it. There's typically they're doing it for the protection of their animals and for the protection of their land. But not always cut and dry. Everyone kind of has a different reason for going into it, if that kind of makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, because whenever there is a kind of pest that is shot above land, there's actually a big controversy. I'm not sure
Mhm.
to say, but there's a big discussion within the UK and the EU about the use of lead cartridges. For example, especially
Mm.
pigeons are a big problem here for a lot of farmers because they eat a lot of the seeds, which significantly reduces the yields. And there is a big argument around using of lead shot, and there's a lot of kind of regulatory push to move towards just only allowing use of steel shot.
Mhm.
So how is what is kind of the impact, if of using kind of the ammunition when you're shooting? If you do use a lot of lead cartridges, is there a notable impact on the actual crop, or is that just marginal? And again, kind of like with the GMOs, it is heavily driven by fear. This move that's going on in the UK.
So I will say that I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but recently, in my home state of California, they recently changed the regulation, so we're not allowed to use lead shot. We can only use steel shot for hunting,
Hmm.
and that had some ramifications on the hunting communities. But I wouldn't say it had massive changes in terms of agricultural purposes. I personally don't know if there is a massive, drawback to using lead shot on agricultural land. I'm not sure if I mean, maybe there is, and I just haven't been told about it. But a lot of the people that I know that were impacted by that, I mean, right now it's not much of an issue because you can't even get ammo. I mean, everywhere ammo is just sold out
Oh yeah,
because
U.S. is with
it's terrible.
because yeah, because I like in Czech Republic, we make a massive amount of ammunition, so there's
Mhm.
always a surplus. So even when there was a small kind of rush for weapons, for like guns and ammunition, we had more than enough. And I remember talking to some friends in the U.S. and they were like, "Can you just send me like a box of 9 millimeter? I'll pay you like $200."
Right. Yeah. So
So
that's like,
it's ridiculous.
yeah. So like having the conversation about that right now is just like that's not a thing. But I can
Right.
speak on how it was before everything went crazy. Um, but yeah. So the people that I usually go shooting with or go hunting with, they're all dairymen. They're all actively involved in the dairy industry. I know some that grow trees or they grow other row crops, and when they switched over to the steel shot, they were talking about everything about how terrible steel shot was when hunting, just because it was way less efficient. It didn't travel as far. It didn't seem to impact the animals as much, which also caused issues because when hunting, kind of the idea from the humanitarian perspective is if you shoot an animal, you shoot to kill. You do not
Yeah.
allow that animal to suffer, and so they were kind of concerned from that perspective. That they never really mentioned anything about it impacting their farms at all. They seemed to not really think that it had much of an impact. It didn't really affect the soil much, but that might have been kind of just the ignorance of the farmers at the time. They didn't really understand that it was causing any issues if it was. But I haven't, I again, I haven't done the research on it properly, but I haven't heard of any potential long term negative effects that could be drawn from using lead shot versus steel shot.
Yeah, because like when I was kind of looking at this and I was kind of thinking about it, you have a lot of game that is hunted with lead shots. Like you have boars that are often sometimes you shot with slugs, which are just an ounce of lead, and they're all past like the food and safety
Mm,
requirements, so they can be eaten. So it seems to me like, well, if you can literally eat an animal that was just shot through with lead, and there's no really high concentrations in the land, it would have made sense to me for that to not be a real problem. But yeah, I don't know as far as the impact of that. But one thing that I just kind of got thinking about is there was kind of a video from made in Czech Republic back in 2018 around the conservation that was talking a lot about the impact, because you were talking about row crops and like trees and all that,
mhm.
and there was a discussion there about the kind of the impact of adding trees and all that to line a lot of fields and how that affected the wildlife population as far as how it used the field and things like that. So what are kind of the considerations that go into, for example, adding the trees and all that, and then maybe how it might tie into the effects on wildlife?
So a big part of the decision of using trees versus row crops and or doing other styles of agriculture tend to rely on the markets mostly, and that's kind of the biggest driver is the markets, and secondary kind of comes from the viability of the land that's available to them. So which you would think it'd be the opposite, but that's farmers got to make money too. So kind of the first consideration that goes into it is, so like I'll speak, on behalf of my hometown, Tulare. We are a dairy state. Like we're actually considered the dairy capital of California, and California is the dairy capital of the world, and all that kind of stuff. So we are very, very heavily focused on the dairy industry. Well, I'd say probably about, let's see, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even longer, the dairy industry started to see a pretty heavy decline in the economy. Milk prices started going way down, price of calves was going way down. The cost to actually run a dairy just wasn't quite what it used to be. And so it became really, really hard for smaller dairies to kind of sustain themselves economically. And so they started looking into other facets as kind of ways of maintaining their agricultural land without having to sell out and lose the family farm kind of idea, but without having to lose basically all of their money to the dairy, the lacking dairy economy. So that was kind of a big motivation for a lot of them to move towards the tree route, and especially because they chose trees because, for one, they're not perennial. Is it perennial? I can't remember which one's which. They're long term. They're not like row crops where you have to rotate them every season and all that kind of stuff. Trees just stay for like years. And so there was a big push for almonds and pistachios to start being planted, because almonds are they mature more rapidly, but they only produce for about 7 years, whereas pistachios, they take quite a few years to produce. Almonds, I think, start producing after 7 years. I could be completely wrong on this. I need to get my numbers straight. They start producing after a few years, but they don't produce for as long. Whereas pistachio trees, they take much longer to start producing, but they produce a lot higher quality product, a lot higher price product, and they produce for like 100 years. So that was a big motivation, was they don't have to worry about row cropping. They don't have to worry about crop rotation or worrying about the soil or anything like that. They could just plant their trees. They could, fertilize them. They could check on the soil composition to make sure the soil is fertile properly enough for the trees. They could irrigate them, and that was it. Like, they didn't have to really worry about it. A big move towards, the trees was also, like I said, there's obviously the economic reasons, was they could make a lot of money off of those crops, but it was also the convenience thing. They weren't having to worry about checking the markets all the time and making sure that their crop was going to be sustainable, because they really weren't going to rip out those trees. Like, there was no reason to, because even if if the fruit they were producing wasn't profitable right now, it probably would be by the next year, or by the next few months or whatever. So, whereas they couldn't rely on that kind of sustainability with the dairies or with some of the row crops. So, and a lot of it had to do with our soil. We're right in the heart of California, which has some of the most fertile soil in the world, and it can grow almost anything. So really, it was kind of like, well, what's the most profitable crop? We're going to grow that here. So that was part of it. In terms of its impact on the wildlife, that I'm not entirely sure of. I haven't noticed major changes to the wildlife in the area. I will say that the pests obviously are going to be a bit different, just because there's different fruit now versus what there used to be. They went from growing corn to growing pistachios, and they have very different types of pests. So you would see migrations of different pest species that we typically wouldn't see, but mostly they're small bugs that don't really impact the urban population. So it wasn't something that was like common knowledge to most people. So I mean, I don't know. It's difficult to say that there was no changes in terms of the ecosystem, because there definitely was, but I couldn't speak on behalf of like major changes to the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And just a question, because I realized I have no idea. Pistachios, they're not domestic to California, are they?
Right. So pistachios originally come from Japan, and for the longest time, Japan was the only country that produced them. California originally, or after a while, California started to grow their own, and they kind of took over the pistachio market. But yeah, it used to just be Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like when normally kind of discussions in offices like in the UK that I've seen about introducing like a new crop, like let's imagine the UK was bringing in pistachios. That would be kind of a nationwide massive discussion about the impact and considerations of increasing this and everything that's going on. While the way you described it in the US, it seems like the farmers were like, hey, pistachios are what makes most sense for us to kind of increase here. Let's do that. Like, how is kind of the approach to the impact of bringing new types of crops different in the U.S.? Or, well, on one hand, I suppose like with globalization, there isn't that many new crops you can bring in around the world. But I suppose like how is the approach in the U.S. around something like this?
I mean, It's difficult to say because I think, and this has kind of just been in my experience, I could be completely wrong, but it seems to me that in the US, agriculture is a bit more of an independent enterprise, whereas in other countries, it tends to be a lot more either community driven or kind of more like not community driven is a bad word for it. It seems to be a lot more, people focus on the market of their area instead of just kind of what they want to do by themselves. And I think in the United States, it's a lot more kind of, this is what I want to do because this is what I want to do. There's a certain level of consideration for your area and kind of who works, around you. So like, if I wanted to grow orange trees where I live right now, I would need to make sure that somebody who can collect orange trees and bring them to the processing plant is nearby. I can't just grow orange trees out in the middle of nowhere because then I'm gonna have to bring them into town by myself, and I don't want to have to do that. So there's a certain consideration for location in that regard, but other than that, most people kind of just function off of what they want to do. Like if one guy in a town full of corn growers decides he wants to grow cotton because he looked at the markets and cotton was doing well, he would do that. And so it's a lot less dependent on kind of a group mentality that I tend to see more common in more European countries, and it's almost more of like a I'm going to do this. And if you guys think it's a good idea, then you can join me. If not, then screw you. I'm going to do it anyways. And
Mm.
that actually did happen a couple years ago. Cotton used to be a very popular commodity in California, especially in my part of California. And then it kind of died off for a while. A few years ago, though, for some reason, the cotton market just started booming. And literally, almost every farmer in my hometown started growing cotton, which they haven't done in a long time. Now, obviously, I'm sure you can imagine, that saturated the market and brought the price back down. So nobody grew cotton anymore. But that kind of stuff happens pretty frequently is, you have one guy who's like, I'm going to see if this works, and it works, and everyone who follows in and does it, and then it stops working. So then they have to change their formula. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. I was kind of having a hard time kind of.
Yeah, no, that makes sense because basically, yeah, since you're like in the US, it's very much just demand driven, while in Europe, you have a lot of regulation about what crop you can farm. Like I remember I was talking to some farmer down in the south of Czech Republic, and he was telling me, well, I want to switch to this crop because the demand and all that is here, but the government won't let me. Which now, look at the US, that seems kind of a very different approach. But what that kind of makes me think of is, and this is kind of away from hunting more to kind of the finance side again. But when you have, because obviously with all these commodities, they're very much securitized and traded as futures. Typically, when you have kind of large scale farmers, let's say there's a large scale move on the farmer's side towards cotton. Is it typically that they directly sell to the suppliers that then form those futures contracts, or are they usually directly counterparties in those futures contracts, or how do they typically operate on, like from the farmer's perspective? What's the typical way to kind of fix in the prices to mitigate some of that inconsistency in the market?
So it can vary from operation to operation. Usually, like kind of smaller operations will have a very different approach than larger, larger production facilities. I know that for most industries, they're part of LLCs or other kind of third party organizations that can kind of uh, basically preserve the security of those farmers. So I know, for example, we have a few dairy LLCs in my area, and these LLCs will kind of uh, basically be like the umbrella company for all of these dairies. Like these dairies are independent farms, obviously, but they are contracted with these LLCs that kind of preserve them a market security, and those LLCs tend to negotiate with the futures. And so as the markets rise and fall, the LLCs may preserve a very like a set price. So like let's just say if the price for milk is doing really good one year, the LLCs have an agreed price for what the price of milk is. So the farmer still gets his money no matter how good the milk is. Or let's just say it's really, really bad one year, the LLCs protect the farmers from any losses they might have experienced. So you tend to have kind of third party organizations there to help mitigate some of those massive changes in the markets. And they tend to do a lot of the communication with the people who are responsible or at least more interactive with the futures and that kind of stuff. So that's typically the most effective way to do it. Because otherwise that's actually the reason why so many small farmers struggle so much, is because they're running almost independently. And when you run independently and your market is what dictates whether or not you make money, it can be really difficult to survive. So they typically kind of look for third parties to kind of help with that process.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But this kind of got me thinking about, well, what do is this just a general pattern where majority of the industry has moved over to using kind of third parties that then kind of securitize, actually just provide security as far as pricing, or is there still a large part of the farming industry which is kind of more small, like kind of these small? I know that aren't really kind of small, but like kind of smaller farmers which don't go through the LCs, which then sell more directly to the market. And how does that actually work? How how do they approach? Like how can a normal farmer sell to the market, in a more of a traditional way? Because I would assume that's again through third counterparties.
Mhm. So there's obviously going to be diversity, and like every operation is going to function differently. Most farms in the United States are what we consider like kind of like a large farm, and the reason why is because, like I mentioned earlier, between regulations and drastic changes in markets, it's really difficult for small farmers to thrive anymore. And so a lot of small farmers sell their land out to larger farms, not for the sake of, the larger farms bought them out, but more so because they're worried about that land getting eaten up by urbanization, and they'd rather it stay agricultural land even if they don't own it anymore. So a lot of small farms kind of become part of larger farms, just for the sake of their own security, and for the security of their family. Actually, I know there are even some farms who buy out smaller farms and still let them operate as if it's their own, but just to make sure that they don't go under. So that's kind of one of the approaches that you'll see pretty often. But in terms of selling straight to the market as an independent, agriculturalist, it's not a super easy thing to do, but it is possible. You'll see a lot of farmers markets kind of happen because of that. You'll see a lot of farm gate operations actually starting to become more popular. That's an operation where consumers can go straight to the door of the farmer and buy the product straight from him instead of going through the processor and the retailer and all those other steps. That's becoming more and more popular. You're starting to see. There are some farmers who can afford to go straight to the markets, but again, because of all of the price, the price differences between the security from the LLC and just trying to do it yourself, they tend to get undercut a lot, and that can kind of discourage them from engaging with the markets too much. So it really depends on the size of the operation and how much they're willing to risk / bear. But yeah, this is where you kind of start to see divisions in the actual types of operations start to happen. You see operations that are focused more on feeding other parts of the industry. So like, in the cattle industry, for example, you have parts of the cow of the beef industry that focus on just producing beef, and you have parts that just focus on producing calves, and those calves go on to the operations to produce beef. So it's like you start to see almost many industries start to produce that are not even focused on feeding into the market. They're more focused on benefiting those farmers who are feeding into the market. And that's where the farm gate operations come in, and that's where the farmers markets come in. And so kind of like, for smaller operations, because like I said, they're not quite as common anymore, they're starting to have to find new niches to get into the markets that still make their food viable without having to go through the third parties in the markets and all that kind of stuff.
And how does that work? Because again, in Europe, if you had like a farm trying to sell directly to consumers, there'd be an issue with kind of the food standards review, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that they would have to deal with. As far as the government would want to absolutely check everything, it would get kind of ridiculous for them. How does this work in the U.S.? Because imagine, if you go to a retailer, there's a very established process. But if a farm is selling direct to consumer, which is actually becoming a big trend in businesses in general, and I think it's very good. But how does that work as far as the maintenance of standards?
Yeah. So, and like you said, it's food safety is the number one priority of that kind of operation. And typically the governments will heavily regulate those types of operations just on food safety, but they get to avoid a lot of the other more market-based regulations that a lot of farmers tend to struggle with. So that's kind of the advantage to it. From the food safety perspective, I actually got to tour one of these farm gate operations. It was a hog producing setup, and they basically were explaining to me that they have to get certified for food safety training and all this kind of stuff, and they have to be inspected, pretty regularly, as I'm sure you can imagine. And if they don't pass their inspections, then they don't get to sell food out their door. So while there's, I guess, less of a guarantee of the food safety that you would normally get through the commercial operations, there's people seem to find more comfort in being able to go straight to the door rather than have to buy it at the store, that kind of thing, because they like to support the community. So consumers trusting it, plus how often they get inspected, plus they have to have all their food safety stuff in, like, it become kind of almost the same thing as following the standards that a restaurant would have to follow, where they have to have all their food safety, stuff, in order. They get regular inspections to make sure all their facilities are up to code and all that kind of stuff. They get the same thing. So if they're not up to code, if they're not following those same procedures, then they're going to get shut down like that. So there's a lot of government control in that regard, but it's even with the government kind of poking their nose in it, there's still quite a bit of independence that those operations get to kind of thrive off of.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. My concern wasn't really about kind of the safety of it, but more of how difficult it is for the farmers, because I know this regulation often makes a lot of stuff very difficult. So I was mainly asking with the interest of, is it actually easy enough for the small farmers to do for it to stay sustainable? But
yeah, it seems like it's getting
kinda,
easier. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, sorry, so that's fine. But when it with it being easier, and there's a lot of kind of discussions around like vertical farming and all this being brought into cities, would that is that something that you've seen kind of discussed or considered, or is this maybe even happening where bringing kind of as vertical farming is kind of tried to be brought into cities, that would allow an opportunity to do this kind of very direct to consumer selling, well, right in the city, just straight from the farm? Is this something that has been tested, or is this a model that's just kind of an idea that hasn't really been worked out yet?
I think that as vertical farming continues to develop, this we'll start to see this more commonly. Vertical farming is still kind of in the experimental phase here, so we really haven't seen a whole lot of that integrated properly into our cities yet. I will say that I think that you have a pretty good prediction about that potentially becoming a more viable source of almost like farm to plate interactions, but yeah, we haven't exactly gotten the practice down to a T yet, to a point where we trust it to be a regular source of food for the community. So yes, I think that there's a lot of potential there. I don't think that's gonna, I don't think it's gonna be quite as sustainable as large scale agriculture, obviously. But it might serve like smaller communities and kind of be like a good niche for certain types of people that don't trust like large scale farming or something like that. But yeah, until we perfect the practice of vertical farming, I don't think it's gonna be a regular practice just yet.
Mm-hmm. And how does the actual kind of scaling compare between large scale farming and kind of trying to build in more vertical farming? Because whenever it was kind of mentioned to me, it's always kind of proposed as a solution to that the increased demand. Well, solution to that be, well, you can use more land, use vertical farming. So that's the way I've always looked at it, because that's the way it was always presented to me. So I was wondering, how does it kind of compare to the efficiency? Would kind of the large scale farming just ramping up more be is a more of a reasonable solution, or as vertical farming will that play kind of an important role to keeping up with that?
So I'm looking at an article right now, kind of to answer your question, because I actually haven't done my research on how large vertical farming needs to be sufficient in terms of production. Because I've done my research on vertical farming, but that was kind of always like a it might be a thing someday kind of talk. So this says that 1 acre of an indoor area offers equivalent production of at least 4 to 6 acres of outdoor capacity. So if you're looking at a scale of 1 acre can get you about, let's just say, 5 acres of an actual farm, then we might actually see a decent amount of viability in terms of production. It would just depend on how big of an operation that we can actually sustain. And I would say that, because I'm not sure what the production of the actual like crops you use through vertical farming it looks like, if it's the same types of yields as large scale farming or not. Let's just say it is. Vertical farming could be a nice supplement to traditional agriculture. I don't think it'll ever replace it by any means, but I think that with that 1 to 5 scale, that seems like it'd be a pretty good potential solution to our lack of land that we're starting to see, because that's one of the primary concerns of agriculture right now, is just the exponentially increasing loss of land. So might be a good thing to look into.
Yeah, and like, what about kind of the impact of kind of the pollution of the cities? Because now that I'm, if it is kind of used at a scale in cities, on one hand, it could kind of help cut back on the pollution, because naturally, plants, that's why you plant more trees in a city, because they kind of clean the air. But on the other hand, that a massive amount of pollution could have an impact on the quality of the plants and the ability to consume the plants. What is kind of the relation of the impact on pollution, both positive and the negative on the plants?
So you kind of highlighted it pretty well there. I think that a lot of the advantage to using plants in urban areas is to try to clean the air. If we were to try to grow food in those areas, I think that there would have to be some kind of assessment of what the food safety of that product would look like. I think there might be the potential because I mean, we talked earlier about how we have crops that are both genetically modified and non that can absorb carbon and nitrogen from the air and put it back into the soil to try to regenerate some of that. I'm not sure how that would be applicable from a vertical farming perspective because we don't use traditional soil. Obviously, there's a very distinct way of growing that food. So maybe if we could trick the plants, because we could trick plants into doing all kinds of stuff. We tricked plants to stop having seeds. I mean, it's not hard to trick plants. They're not very smart. But maybe we could trick plants into absorbing some of the pollution and just kind of putting it somewhere else or even using it to benefit some plants. I would say that if that were to become a thing, we would start to see almost biosecure farms for food production in urban areas, and then non-biosecure farms that are dedicated to cleaning air. Like almost like these crops are for pollution management. These crops are for food, but don't go in that area until we get the pollution situation figured out. I can see something like that happening more frequently if we do decide to go that route.
And what is kind of the view of a lot of the kind of farming community on implementation of vertical farms? Is it more of a, well, this is going to be very interesting for us, let's get into this business potentially, or is it more of a, well, this could actually move a lot of the business, like some of the business away from us, let's see how it goes?
As with most new innovations in agriculture, the farming community is pretty split on it. There a lot of the more traditional farmers, like the 58-year-old that I was talking about, like the old school kind of farmers, they're completely against it. They're like, hey, let's just keep farming where it's at. Why are we going to go to the cities? That's not how this works. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. But they also tend to realize they also tend to not realize that we are in kind of a land crisis. We're very low on usable land, and when their farm is no longer sustainable, we're going to run out of food pretty quickly if we don't find other ways of growing it. A lot of the newer generation farmers I've found are pretty supportive of the idea because they support the idea of just maintaining agriculture in any way we can, even if it has to adapt. Obviously, they like to keep agriculture traditional to what we have now, but if it comes down to it and we need to supplement our food production with some kind of urban development of agriculture, I don't think that very many new generations of agriculturalists are going to oppose that very much. Actually, there's quite a few of them that are working towards trying to help with that thing, because myself included, the new generation of farmers, I'm not a farmer, but the new generation of agriculturalists, we want urban dwellers to get involved in agriculture. We want people who are not from rural areas to find an interest in what we're doing and to try to, to put some passion into it. So if people want to start growing vertical farms in cities and, they want to start, getting community projects working on agricultural projects that are outside of the rural sectors, by all means, a lot of us are very much on board with that. It's just that not everyone in the community is going to be, super gung ho about it. But what are you going to expect?
Right. I think this kind of brought us roundabout to the start, and it reminded me of one more question that I had to ask before. I think I'll be completely exhausted of any questions I have. I'll have to process this for a while to figure out, because it was very interesting, which is like, what are kind of the active kind of efforts into actually getting more people into farming? Because we talked about that, the games and movies and all that, which feels like kind of more of a passive because it's more involved because it exists. But are there any more active efforts, for example, on the educational sides, for example, schools, universities, things like that, or for example, like doing apprenticeships or things like that to encourage more people to go into farming, or is it mainly the stuff we talked about at the start?
Well, ironically enough, you're looking at it. We are actually engaging in it right now. A lot of involvement of let me back up a little bit. The idea of getting people involved in agriculture that don't come from it is kind of a newer idea. It's something that a lot of those involved in agriculture didn't really see to be an issue until recently. A lot of them still don't. That's kind of a newer generation thing too, is we're starting to see the issue with people not knowing where their food comes from and voting off of those decisions, even though they don't know what's happening. I started my podcast 3 years ago, and I'm in school right now studying to be a teacher, a high school agriculture teacher. There are a lot of in the United States, there's a lot of agricultural education programs that are focused on getting kids involved in agriculture and teaching them leadership skills like public speaking and job interviews and like how to lead teams and problem solving and all that kind of stuff, with the basis of learning agriculture as kind of their examples to benefit those things. I learned how to speak by speaking on agricultural issues. Before high school, I grew up in an agricultural town with parents who were involved in it, but I had no interest in it. When I started speaking about these issues and saw how big of a deal this was, I immediately changed my mind and decided I wanted to be a teacher because I thought it was too important to just not let this happen. So I started my podcast back 3 years ago when I was 18, when I was, a senior in high school, because I had seen that the root of a lot of the issues that were facing agriculture were due to people not really knowing where the food came from. That the issue of GMOs was an education issue. That the issue with pesticides was an education issue, or rather a communication issue. That the issue with new technology was a communication and education issue. So I kind of made it my goal to incorporate more people, not just those who are going into high school, but those who have already left and have already kind of missed their chance to still be able to learn about agriculture. And so I searched, because I used to listen to podcasts all the time. I still do occasionally, but I searched like relentlessly for podcasts about agricultural education. Couldn't find a single one. Every agriculture podcast was about the economy. It was about the industry. It was about the technology. None of them were about education or having conversations with people outside of the industry. So I decided to make my own. And I decided to start off by interviewing people in agriculture to try to get their perspectives on it and to try to provide information to people about their industries. That worked for about 2 years, didn't get super popular, but that was fine. And then I decided to switch it up and actually approach people directly. I started to kind of realize that people aren't going to go looking for agriculture. It needs to be brought to them because they don't care unless it's not necessarily shoved down their throats, but kind of, unless their attention is brought to it, because it's not at the forefront of their minds. So I focused my efforts on having conversations with people directly about these issues, about what's going on in agriculture, about why it's worth talking about why they should care. And as I did that, I was kind of surprised to find that there's a ton of people that are curious about agriculture. Like they have so much interest, so much passion for it, but they had nowhere to learn about it. I got a bunch of my other friends in the ag industry involved in this. Now they are all running podcasts. I'm not going to say I was the founder of Ag Education Podcast, but I definitely was one of the first. And I found quite a few since I've started that have kind of followed in my footsteps, that have seen the importance of this, this conversation, and have kind of taken it into their own hands. So now there's a ton of ag education based projects out there. There's websites that are dedicated to curriculum that can be used on kindergarten through eighth grade kind of schools that help kids learn about agriculture at a young age. There are education systems for high school students, for university students. There's podcasts that are dedicated to agricultural education and having conversations like the ones we just had. There's all kinds of projects and things that people are working on right now, all dedicated to making sure that those who do not know about agriculture have the chance to learn about it because they didn't before. So that's kind of the effort right now is, agriculture, we're really behind the game. We're very technologically advanced, but we haven't been on Facebook ever. This is something that, farmers don't actively get involved in social media. They don't actively get involved in online projects. And this is why people don't know about agriculture, because we are not telling them. And so myself and a few of my friends have made an effort out of trying to include those in agriculture who want to learn about it. That's why I don't refuse anyone an interview. And there's no such thing as a stupid question, because people want to learn as long as you give them the chance to learn. And a big problem for agriculture for a while was we were turning people away because we didn't trust them and they didn't trust us. And that was the wrong approach. And so to answer your question, that was a long-winded answer, but yes, there are things out there that are working on trying to integrate people in agriculture more. I think there needs to be more things out there. I think we need to be working harder, and that there needs to be more of an integration of agriculture into common education systems than there is, especially worldwide, because the United States is one of the few countries that actually does implement agriculture into common education, but they don't require it. It's just an elective. You can just take it if you want to. I think it needs to be, again, not drilled in anybody's mind, but they need to have better access to that information if they're looking for it, and that's not happening. And so that's something that's kind of the goal of this podcast and others like it is, to make sure that people are getting integrated with their food and where it comes from and everything that goes around it.
Yeah, no, I have to say, like, that's really great, and especially like with your podcast and all that. You're doing an absolutely amazing job. I've really enjoyed this. Great, great question, great job, like answering everything the way you explain stuff. It really makes a lot of sense. And I just do want to say kind of one thing, because you mentioned that in a lot of kind of Europe, you don't have kind of the agriculture education. Well, actually, what we do have is where whenever you're doing geography, there is so you have one term, so about 6 months spent specifically on farming. Once in primary school, once in middle school, and once in high school, and where geography is a compulsory, compulsory module. And as such, we actually do have a bit of kind of compulsory farming education, which is where basically most of my farming education comes from. But yeah, so like, thank you very much, for doing this. I have to say it's really fascinating, and I'm definitely gonna listen to this podcast, after this, because I just want to learn more. I'm really excited about this.
Awesome. Well, I definitely appreciate you taking the time. I mean, I actually didn't know that about European education systems. So that's really cool. I'm actually glad that I was able to learn that, because I've said forever that, other countries, because, not to say that the United States does it better, because the United States honestly has a terrible education system, and our agricultural education is good, but it could be a lot better. And like I said, it's not compulsory like your guys' is, which is something I think needs to be stressed a bit more. But no, I think that, it was definitely a lot of fun. I really enjoyed having the conversation. I'm glad that you're able to bring kind of the more economic side of things to this, because this is something that doesn't get brought up a ton in my conversations. People want to know the specifics of the operation, not so much what the economic side of things is going to be, or how that impacts the world market versus just the agricultural market and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it was a lot of fun. I think you asked some great questions, and if you have more, I always like to invite my guests a chance to come back on. So if you come up with more stuff, then we are more than happy to do a part 2.
Absolutely. I feel like today I'm gonna go away. I'm gonna think about it. I'm gonna sleep, but I guarantee you, in the morning, I'm gonna send you like 1,000 more questions.
Please do. And anytime I see articles that makes me think of my guests, or anything that, I think, there's been a few questions you asked me today that I didn't know the answer to. And anytime that happens, I'm the kind of person that if I don't know, I need to know. So I'll go and do the research, and I'll send it to you and all that kind of stuff. So you may get some articles from me from stuff that reminds me of you.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Before we close out, would you like the chance to kind of replug all your stuff, let everyone know who you are and where they can find you?
I think all I'm just going to mention, I'm Allison Mahood. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter, which is Tim2. It's spelled weirdly. It's QUA number 2 and M2, and I feel like I misspelled it. So I'm just going to probably send it to you so you can put it in the description, but I don't really mind plugging anything, because it's been just really enjoyable. So keep listening to this podcast if you are, because it's really nice.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the kind words, and I'll definitely plug that down below so people can find you. And yeah, so I like I said, it really meant a lot. You were able to take the time to talk about all this stuff with me. It's definitely been a lot of fun. Excuse me. It's definitely been a lot of fun. And yeah. So, and also thanks to all the listeners, all the supporters that have been, back in this podcast since day one. I appreciate each and every one of you. Hope to catch all you guys next week. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.